In the quiet corridors of a luxurious yet humble mansion nestled in the heart of Palo Alto, California, the CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, lived a life that defied every imaginable odds. Despite his title and the unimaginable demands of a global tech giant, Sundar had not lost his connection to the ordinary, the very essence that had brought him to extraordinary heights. It was an unusually chilly Wednesday night in late autumn. The trees swayed in silence, their golden leaves dancing with the gentle wind under the amber glow of street lamps. Inside, the world's most influential technocrat had just concluded an intense video conference call with his counterparts in Asia. His eyes burned from the blue light of screens, and his mind wrestled with 100 thoughts about upcoming projects, AI ethics and market regulations. Deciding to step away from the chaos of thought, Sundar made himself a cup of warm ginger tea, a reminder of his Chennai roots, and quietly descended the stairs toward the home library, a sanctuary rarely disturbed by noise or presence. As he reached the middle landing, something odd caught his ear. The faint rustle of pages and the rhythmic scratching of a pencil. He stopped. The sound came from the pantry hallway where the domestic staff quarters were located, a place rarely ventured into by anyone at this hour. Curious and guided by a sense of quiet concern, Sundar walked slowly toward the faint light, spilling from beneath the half-closed door of the small study used by the household help for meal planning and chores. As he peeked through the opening, he froze. There, seated cross-legged on the cold tiled floor with a dim lamp and a worn notebook, was Meera, the family's part-time maid. She was no older than 19, her hair tied up in a simple bun, her forehead glistening with sweat and determination. The pages of her notebook were filled with mathematical equations, English paragraphs, and what looked like textbook notes. Scattered around her were borrowed books from the local library, high school level, and a few marked grade 12 board prep. She was studying. It was nearly 1:45 a.m. For a moment, Sundar was speechless. This girl, who had silently cleaned his home, dusted his bookshelves and washed the dishes every evening, was now preparing for an academic future by candlelight, sacrificing sleep and comfort to chase something that seemed impossibly distant. Meera didn't notice him at first. She was too engrossed in solving a geometry problem. Her eyes darted from diagram to formula, whispering theorems under her breath. Sundar gently knocked on the doorframe. She gasped and scrambled to her feet, knocking over the lamp in the process. "Sir, I'm sorry, I was just—" Her voice quivered, her hands shaking as she tried to hide the papers. Sundar raised his hand gently. "It's okay, Meera. Please sit down." Her eyes widened with fear. "I didn't mean to use the room without permission. I'll leave." "No," he interrupted softly. "You're studying at 2 a.m. after a long day of work. Why?" The words fell heavy in the silence. Meera swallowed hard, her eyes suddenly moist. "I want to go to college," she said, her voice barely audible. "My mother used to say education was the only way out. She died 2 years ago. My younger brother is sick. I can't afford school fees anymore. But I found old books at the library. I'm trying to pass my high school equivalency exam. Maybe then I can get a better job. Help my brother get out of this." Sundar stood still. The room, the world seemed to pause around them. In her tired eyes, he saw a reflection of his own past. A boy growing up in a modest 2-room home in Chennai with no television, barely enough to make ends meet, yet nurtured by the dreams his parents planted in him. The boy who used to ride buses across the city to use a public computer lab. The boy who believed education was the only way out. And here she was, living that same story, years apart, oceans away, but with the same fire. He walked in slowly, pulled up a small stool and sat across from her. "What's the topic you're working on?" Meera blinked. Circle theorems. I can't seem to get this one. Sundar smiled. Let me see. For the next 40 minutes, the CEO of Google sat on a wooden stool in a pantry hallway, explaining tangents and arcs to a young woman in broken slippers and oversized hand-me-downs. She listened with eyes wide open, her pencil racing across them. Pages, her fear melting into fascination. When they finished the problem set, he looked at her and said, "You have the mind of an engineer, Meera. Don't ever let anyone make you doubt that." Tears welled up in her eyes. No one had ever said that to her, not even her teachers back when she still went to school. Sundar stood, brushing imaginary dust off his pants. "Go get some sleep. And tomorrow, after work, come find me. We're going to talk about your education plan." "Sir, you don't have to." "I know I don't," he said gently, "but I want to. And someday, when you're in a position to help someone like yourself, I hope you will too." That's how we change things. The next morning, wordlessly, Meera swept the floors, her mind racing. Had she dreamt the entire thing? Surely she hadn't really sat and solved math problems with Sundar Pichai in the middle of the night. But just before noon, as she carried fresh laundry upstairs, she found a sealed envelope on her folded pile with her name on it. Inside was a note. "Meet me in the study at 5 p.m. Bring your books. Also bring dreams. Lots of them. SP," and beneath the note a simple pamphlet. "California Adult High School Diploma Program. Spring Intake 2025. Her hands trembled as she held it close. The day after Sundar's unexpected midnight interaction with Meera dawned quietly, yet beneath its serenity, something had shifted in the universe, at least for Meera. Her feet moved through her usual morning chores, but her soul floated above, it all brimming with a strange mixture of disbelief, anticipation, and the fragile early glimmers of hope. The white envelope with Sundar's handwritten note remained tucked deep inside her apron pocket like a hidden talisman, a secret piece of magic that only she knew about. Each time she remembered the words, "Bring dreams," lots of them, her chest tightened with emotion, and her throat threatened tears. She had worked in this house for just over 8 months now, brought in through an agency that specialized in placing part-time domestic help in the homes of the well-off. She had only been given this particular placement because the regular help had taken sudden medical leave. Before this, she'd floated from house to house, cleaning kitchens and bathrooms, her presence largely ignored unless something went wrong. She never thought a single soul would look past her mop and broom, let alone speak to her as if her aspirations mattered. She certainly never imagined the CEO of Google would be the one to do it. The mansion was eerily calm that day. Sundar had a string of calls and virtual conferences, and the rest of the household moved quietly around him, aware of the gravity of his schedule. But Meera was less focused on the whispers of executives in conference rooms and more on the clock that crawled. Toward 5 p.m., her fingers trembled slightly every time she glanced at it. She couldn't eat her lunch. The thought of walking into Sundar's personal study made her dizzy, yet an invisible hand kept urging her forward. What if it wasn't real? What if he had simply been generous in a moment of sentimentality and forgotten everything by morning? At precisely 4:55 p.m., Meera approached the study room door with the hesitation of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to step back or leap. The room had always been something she passed by, a space of quiet reverence filled with sleek shelves, soft leather-bound books, architectural sketches, and a simple oak desk where Sundar often sat late into the night, thinking, reading, planning the future of technology. She had never stepped inside. Her heart pounded as she knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately. Sundar stood in his casual slacks and blue pullover, his glasses perched on his nose, his face lined with the fatigue of the day, but his smile warm and inviting. "Right on time," he said. Meera's voice was barely above a whisper. I brought the books and notes. And the dreams? He asked gently. She gave a small, nervous laugh, not knowing how to respond. He stepped aside, and she entered, clutching her books to her chest like a shield. The room smelled faintly of paper, sandalwood, and something else. Comfort, perhaps. It wasn't as intimidating as she had imagined. Sundar motioned for her to sit at the smaller round table in the corner of the study, already set with 2 chairs, a fresh notebook, and 2 cups of chai. He sat across from her, hands clasped, his demeanor open and non-judgmental. Tell me everything, Meera, about your school, your exams, what you've studied, what you haven't. I want the whole picture. It was the first time in her life that someone had asked about her education, like it actually mattered. Not as a formality, not to assess her usefulness, but as if it was worth knowing for its own sake. And so she began. She told him about how she had once been the top of her class until her father died in an accident when she was 13, how her mother had taken up cleaning work to keep them fed, and how Meera had started helping her soon after. She spoke of her love for science and numbers, how she had taught herself long division by watching YouTube videos in public libraries, and how she now studied after work each night, pushing herself to stay awake just a few minutes longer. 1 page at a time. Sundar listened with the intensity of a professor discovering a rare mind. He didn't interrupt. He didn't patronize. When she finished, she expected him to offer her charity, perhaps a scholarship, maybe even a few encouraging words, and then silence. But what he did next startled her more than anything. He took out a sheet of paper and began to draw a timeline. "All right," he said. "You're going to take the California High School Equivalency Test in 3 months. After that, we're enrolling you in a community college with STEM programs. Eventually, we'll transfer your credits to a university. If you're still interested in engineering by then, I'll make sure you have the right tutors, materials, and quiet time to study. We'll build a schedule that respects your work here, but more importantly, your future." Meera stared at the paper as if it were a map to another planet. "But why are you helping me?" she asked, voice cracking under the weight of a lifetime of dismissals. Sundar leaned back and took a sip of his chai before answering. "When I was young," he said, his tone soft but unwavering, "I had very little. My parents couldn't afford luxury, but they gave me an education, and that changed everything. I was lucky to meet people along the way who opened doors for me. Professors, strangers, friends. Now, it's my turn to open doors for someone else, and I'm choosing to open one for you." She could no longer hold back the tears. They spilled quietly down her cheeks, and she quickly wiped them away with the sleeve of her worn sweater, ashamed to be crying in front of someone so powerful. But Sundar didn't flinch. "Tears are okay," he said. "It means you still believe in something." For the next 2 hours, they laid out a plan. He gave her access to a quiet corner in the house where she could study undisturbed after her duties. He arranged for an online tutor to start working with her remotely 3 evenings a week, and most importantly, he gave her a laptop, an older model, but fully functional. It was the first time Meera had ever owned a computer. When she held it in her hands, the moment felt almost sacred. "I'll take care of it," she said earnestly, still struggling to process everything. "I know you will," he replied. That night, Meera didn't study by lamplight in a dark pantry hallway. She sat cross-legged on a cushioned window seat in the sunroom, books neatly arranged, laptop open, earbuds in. For the first time, she didn't feel like a maid pretending to be a student. She felt like a student, a real one, and all it had taken was one person to look at her differently. In the weeks that followed, news of her transformation spread subtly through the household. though no one dared ask directly. The head chef noticed. Meera's hours had shifted slightly, and the housekeeper saw her taking shorter breaks, always retreating to the same spot with headphones and notebooks. But the staff respected the boundaries, silently rooting for her in the quiet way that people do when they recognize someone rising from the ashes. Sundar continued to check in with her regularly, sometimes offering help with difficult topics, sometimes just sitting quietly while she worked. He never made a spectacle of it. To the outside world, he remained the global CEO with his eyes on the future. But inside this house, he had become something far more powerful. A mentor. There were moments of doubt, of course. Days when the workload at home became too much, when equations refused to make sense, when she felt like giving up. But each time she would remember that night, the soft light, the unexpected kindness, the voice that had told her she was capable of more. And so she pressed on. The change was not just in her schedule. It was in the way she walked, the way she spoke, the way she began to carry herself, not as someone apologizing for existing, but as someone. 2 months passed, with the quiet ferocity of a fire burning in a closed room, unseen but unstoppable. Meera's life, once defined by repetition and survival, had transformed into a rhythm of purpose. She now lived in dual worlds, one of chores and cleaning, and another that unfolded under the soft hum of her laptop, filled with chemical equations, coding exercises, and digital whiteboards where her online tutor patiently guided her through algebra and grammar. In both worlds she was present, working harder than she ever had, but for the first time it felt like she was building something. Each day she stepped further into a version of herself she had once thought unreachable. Sundar remained a silent architect behind the scenes, never overbearing, never making her feel like a charity case. His support was subtle but profound. He encouraged her to struggle through problems before stepping in, allowed her the dignity of mistakes, and never once made her feel small. His mentorship was not rooted in grand gestures, but in quiet consistency, a rare and powerful thing, and it was working. Meera's confidence began to rise like morning fog, lifting from a long-forgotten valley. But the world outside their quiet study room had begun to notice. Whispers began like cracks in old pavement, tiny, dismissible, but capable of deep fractures if ignored. It started with the housekeeper, who once looked at Meera with sisterly warmth, but now watched her with veiled suspicion. She had overheard a tutoring session through the hallway one evening and asked, half jokingly, half accusingly, "So what are you now, madam's personal scholar?" Meera had laughed nervously, brushing it off, but the question lingered. The other household staff, too, began to ask questions, not always maliciously, but with that same tinge of curiosity laced with discomfort. They had all accepted their places in the world without question. Why was Meera trying to climb a ladder that wasn't meant for them? Why was she trying to be something more? That silent resistance, the kind that wears a friendly face but cuts through like paper, slowly started closing in on her. Outside the home, it was worse. Meera still lived in a cramped, shared apartment in East San Jose, where the rent was cheap and the walls thinner than paper. Her neighbors, mostly immigrant families and working-class households, started noticing that she no longer stayed out chatting after her shift or participated in the shared TV evenings in the common area. She came home, cooked a quick meal, and returned to her books. Her world was shrinking in some ways, and others were beginning to resent her for it. One evening, as she stood at the community water pump filling her bottle, a familiar voice pierced the cool air. "Hey, Meera, studying again. You think you'll become some big doctor now?" said Kalpana, a distant cousin of her late mother who lived 3 floors above. Her voice was mocking, but the jealousy beneath it was unmistakable. "Maybe. You'll build rockets for America next? Just don't forget us when you're rich." A few of the women laughed, not kindly, but in that passive-aggressive way that women use to discipline other women for breaking the unspoken rules. Meera managed a smile, not because she found it funny, but because years of social training had taught her to use politeness as armor. That night, however, the weight of the laughter pressed hard against her chest. She opened her laptop, stared at the blinking cursor on her practice exam, and for the first time in weeks couldn't focus. The ridicule, the mockery, the isolation. It was beginning to take its toll. She felt like she was climbing a mountain, barefoot, only to be jeered at by those who had never dared to leave the ground. The next morning, she arrived at the mansion a little quieter, her shoulders slightly heavier. Sundar noticed it immediately. He didn't ask at first. Instead, he waited until the evening when she came in for her study session. As they worked through a challenging physics chapter, she struggled more than usual. Her answers came slower. Her eyes were duller. After 20 minutes, he closed the book gently and looked at her with measured calm. "What's going on, Meera?" She hesitated. Then, without lifting her eyes, she said, "People are talking. They think I'm pretending to be something I'm not. They laugh behind my back. Some think you're only helping me because you pity me." Sundar leaned back in his chair, arms folded, expression unchanged. "And do you believe them?" he asked. Meera bit her lip, then shook her head slowly. "No, but it still hurts." He nodded, as if expecting that answer. Then he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "Change is like pulling a thread out of old fabric. The moment you start tugging, the weave complains. It twists, it resists. People don't like watching others grow, because it reminds them of everything they haven't tried. Especially when the person growing looks just like them, talks like them, comes from the same place. It threatens the narrative, and so they push back." She listened, her fingers nervously tracing the spine of her notebook. "But Meera," he continued, his voice firmer now, "you don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe them your stagnation just because they're afraid of their own. Let them whisper, let them laugh. They laughed at the Wright brothers too, until the plane took off." That night, she didn't study to prove anyone wrong. She studied because she knew she was right to want more. That shift, subtle but seismic, anchored her for what came next. In the third month of her preparation, her online tutor, an Indian-American PhD student from Berkeley who had volunteered, upon hearing her story, recommended she take an optional aptitude test offered by the state's Adult Education Board. "It's not mandatory, but if you do well, it adds weight to your college application," he had said. Meera agreed, nervously. It was a full-day exam held at a local community center, and she registered without telling anyone except Sundar. When the day came, she took the morning off work, dressed in her plainest kurta, and walked into the exam hall with trembling hands. Rows of adults sat there, janitors, clerks, immigrants, single mothers, and blue-collar workers, all with the same tired but hopeful eyes. Meera found her seat and took a deep breath. 3 hours later, she emerged exhausted, but strangely light. She didn't know how she had done, but she had shown up. That in itself was victory. 2 weeks later, the results came. She had scored in the 98th percentile statewide. When Sundar read the results, he didn't say much. He simply looked at her and smiled, a quiet nod that said everything. Then he printed out the scorecard and placed it in a sleek file folder with her growing list of achievements. "You're ready," he said. "College applications start next month. We'll begin the process tomorrow." Meera smiled back, but this time it wasn't uncertain. It was the smile of someone who had heard every There are few moments in life when a person stands so firmly at the threshold of a new world that it changes not just their direction, but the very way they perceive time, identity, and possibility. For Meera, that moment arrived quietly, on a breezy spring afternoon, when the envelope from San Jose City College arrived at the front gate, bearing her name in soft serif font, sealed with the promise of beginnings. She had seen enough rejection letters in life to fear the unknown, but this one felt different in her hands, as though it carried the weight not of judgment, but of permission. Inside the thick envelope, printed in ink that trembled in her hands, was the word that lifted her from everything she'd once been told she couldn't be: congratulations. Meera didn't cry this time. She didn't jump or scream or run to announce it to the world. Instead, she sat down on the edge of the courtyard near the rose bushes she often trimmed after lunch and simply stared at the letter as if memorizing it line by line. A calm silence spread through her body like the soft ripples of a pond kissed by morning rain. She had been accepted. That evening, Sundar waited in the study, as he had for months, already knowing the answer by the quiet excitement in her voice when she'd asked to speak with him. When she handed him the letter, his smile was immediate but restrained, that of a man who understood that celebration, when truly earned, didn't need fireworks. It needed only reverence. "Welcome to college, Meera," he said. "This is where you stop surviving and start defining." The first day of classes came fast. Meera, armed with her carefully packed canvas bag, stepped onto campus with nerves curled tight in her chest. The buildings were older than she had expected, with wide glass windows and bulletin boards plastered with student group flyers, internship announcements, and scattered remnants of hopeful doodles. She walked past cliques of students laughing, in languages she didn't understand, their polished sneakers and expensive phones a stark contrast to her thrifted jeans and worn sandals. At every turn, she felt eyes glance past her, not cruelly but indifferently, as if she were part of the background, not quite fitting into the frame of what a typical student looked like. Her first lecture hall smelled of old wood and coffee, the seats arranged in semicircular tiers. She sat near the back, close to the exit, out of both instinct and habit. She watched other students open sleek MacBooks, clicking confidently through tabs. She clutched her donated laptop like a shield, fingers shaking slightly as she opened the first module on basic programming logic. Her professor, a Korean-American woman in her early 40s with thick glasses and the energy of a storm, jumped straight into binary operations and logic gates, and for the first 10 minutes Meera felt like she was drowning. But then something miraculous happened. Her mind, accustomed to patterns, adapted quickly. The logic of circuits, the on-off flow of binary code, felt not unlike the path she had traveled in life. Choices, consequences, gates that only opened with the right input. By the end of the class, her notes were filled. Her laptop had survived its first academic test, and her fear had begun to shrink, not disappear, but shrink. Yet challenges arrived just as swiftly. Group assignments made her uneasy. In one sociology class, she was paired with 3 students who dismissed her quietly, speaking over her and often ignoring her ideas. They didn't know her story. They only saw a quiet, brown-skinned girl with a thick accent and second-hand clothes. She tried to insert herself into conversations, suggesting relevant research and analysis, but her voice barely landed in their curated academic world. When the final presentation came, they offered her the easiest slide and introduced her without her name. Afterward, she walked out of the classroom with her shoulders heavy, not from the assignment, but from invisibility. That evening, Sundar noticed the way she sank into the study chair. Her usual energy dimmed. "Rough day?" he asked, setting down a folder. She nodded. "They didn't even listen. It's like I didn't exist. And the ones who do notice, they look at me like I don't belong here." Sundar leaned forward slightly, choosing his words with care. You belong here more than most, Meera, because you fought to get here. They inherited their place. You built yours from nothing. That intimidates people more than they'll admit. He paused and then said, being underestimated is a gift if you use it right. It gives you room to grow while they're distracted. Stay quiet for now. Learn everything. Watch everyone. And when you speak next time, make sure your work is so good it silences the room. Those words lodged in her like anchors in a storm. And in the weeks that followed, she applied them with quiet, relentless precision. She began sitting at the front of classes. She visited professors during office hours, asking detailed, thoughtful questions. She joined the coding lab, not to socialize, but to learn. She didn't fight for attention. She earned it. Slowly, the same peers who once ignored her began, nodding when she spoke, asking to see her notes, inviting her to study groups. She never bragged, never reminded them of their dismissal. She simply showed up, prepared, each time. And over time they adjusted, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. One day, during a particularly complex data structures workshop, her professor paused and looked directly at her mid-lecture. Meera, how would you optimize this search? Algorithm? She hadn't expected it. All eyes turned toward her. A familiar knot formed in her chest. But she took a deep breath, pulled her chair slightly forward, and began to explain, walking through the recursive logic step by step. By the time she finished, the professor smiled, not just politely, but with genuine admiration. Well done, she said. That's a better approach than the one in the textbook. That moment, though brief, reshaped Meera's internal landscape. It was the first time in a public academic space that her mind had been acknowledged as exceptional. Not, in spite of her background, but without any mention of it. Not as a charity case, not as a success story, just as a scholar. Outside of academics, Sundar encouraged her to attend workshops and speaker sessions, not just to learn, but to connect. At one such seminar, hosted by a non-profit focused on empowering first-generation college students, Meera heard stories that mirrored her own. Students who had crossed oceans, escaped violence, balanced jobs and education while supporting their families. For the first time, she saw a tribe forming around her, people who understood the invisible weight she carried. She joined their mentorship circle, eventually volunteering as a peer advisor. That's when the second transformation began. She was no longer just the one being mentored. She had become a mentor herself. A few months into her first semester, she met Nisha, a high school junior from a struggling neighborhood in Oakland, who had dreams of becoming a doctor but no roadmap. Meera began mentoring her weekly, helping with biology assignments, explaining college applications, and most importantly, just listening. She saw in Nisha the same fire, the same confusion, the same questions she once asked herself in the dark corners of borrowed rooms. When Sundar found out, he didn't say much. He simply smiled. That's the goal, he said, to light someone else's lamp once yours has caught fire. By the end of her first academic year, Meera had made the dean's list, secured a summer research internship in basic AI systems, and started an unofficial club for non-traditional students in STEM. Her past was not erased, but it no longer defined her. It had become the soil from which something larger had grown, something rooted, resilient, and entirely her own. At the celebration dinner held in a modest restaurant near campus, Sundar raised a toast. It was just the two of them, seated across from each other, no cameras, no speeches, just one man honoring a young woman who had proven that even the hardest journeys could lead to the brightest summits. To the girl, he said, lifting his glass of Nimbu Pani, who cleaned my home and now writes the code that shapes the world. To resilience, to reinvention, Meera raised her glass too, to those who open doors quietly and leave them open for others. When a story is born in silence, nurtured in the privacy of quiet sacrifice and invisible labor, there comes a moment when the world takes notice, and that moment rarely arrives gently. For Meera, that moment came wrapped in a neatly folded newspaper, delivered one crisp autumn morning to the Pichai household like every other day. Except on this day, on the lower right corner of the business section, beneath headlines about markets and mergers, was a small column titled, "From Maid to Mathematician, the Unlikely Journey of a Silicon Valley Student." The piece, barely 600 words, had been written by a local journalist who'd overheard Meera's story at a community college event where she had spoken briefly as part of a student panel. A few casual inquiries had been made, some details sourced from faculty, and without Meera's knowledge, her journey had been compressed into a digestible, dramatic narrative for public consumption. It was well-meaning, but incomplete. The kind of story that invited admiration, but lacked the quiet truth of what had really happened in those late-night study sessions and fragile moments of doubt. Still, it was enough. Within days, her email inbox, once quiet and orderly, began to flood with requests from bloggers, student journalists, advocacy groups, and even a regional education-focused podcast. Strangers wanted to hear her speak. Small media outlets asked for interviews. Professors mentioned the article in class, nodding at her with pride. Even students who had once ignored her now suddenly regarded her with a strange mix of awe and cautious envy, as if she had been plucked from obscurity by fate. At first, Meera was overwhelmed. Her instinct was to shrink back into the safe cocoon of her books and routines, to escape into algorithms and lab work where expectations were clear and measurable. But Sundar, ever perceptive, noticed her discomfort and invited her for an evening walk through the quiet streets near the house. The sky was streaked with fading orange, and the air smelled of turning leaves and distant jasmine. "They found the story," he said calmly, hands in his jacket pockets. Meera nodded. "I didn't tell them. I don't even know how they—" "You didn't need to," he interrupted gently. "Stories like yours don't stay hidden forever, especially not when they're wrapped in truth." She looked down at the pavement, then spoke after a long pause. "It feels exposed, like something sacred was shared without permission." Sundar nodded thoughtfully. "That's the price of visibility, Meera. The world loves stories that make it feel better, stories of struggle turned success, especially when told through clean lines and inspiring headlines. But real growth is messy, complicated, and the moment your story leaves your lips, it belongs to others as much as it does to you." "But I'm not done yet," she said, her voice low. "I'm still learning, still making mistakes. They talk like it's over, like I've already made it. But I haven't." "And that," he replied, "is exactly why you're the right person to speak, because the world doesn't need perfect heroes. It needs honest ones." The next day, Meera agreed to her first formal interview, a live session for a local student podcast titled Voices of Change. The studio was nothing glamorous, just a small soundproofed room at a downtown library with a round table, 2 microphones, and a student host named Jamie, who looked more nervous than she did. When the recording began, Meera's voice wavered at first, but as the questions shifted from biography to belief, she found herself speaking not from memory, but from meaning. She talked about studying by candlelight, about wiping floors at dawn, and solving equations at midnight, about failure and guilt, and the strange loneliness of being the first to step out of the life your family had accepted as fate. "But what kept you going?" Jamie asked, near the end, leaning forward. "What stopped you from giving up?" There was silence for a long beat. Then Meera spoke, not just to Jamie, but to the version of herself who had once sat on the pantry floor whispering geometry theorems in the dark. "Someone saw me when I had nothing. No status, no titles, just potential, and instead of walking past me, they sat down beside me. That changes you." After the episode aired, her words rippled far beyond the reach of the small podcast. Clips were shared online, reposted by educational accounts, and within a week, she received an invitation to speak at an annual Student Leadership Summit hosted at Stanford. Her name appeared alongside accomplished undergraduates, activists, and scholarship winners. She almost declined, but Sundar's voice echoed again in her mind. The world doesn't need perfect heroes. She prepared for her talk carefully, not as a performance, but as a responsibility. On the day of the event, she stood backstage in a borrowed blazer, notebook in hand, heart thudding like a warning drum. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage, blinking under the lights, and faced an audience of strangers, young, bright-eyed, eager. She didn't start with her hardships. Instead, she began with a question. Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people? A quiet murmur of recognition swept through the hall. Now imagine feeling that way your whole life, until one person looked at you and said, "I see you, and I believe in who you can become." That's how my journey started. Not with genius, not with luck, but with being seen. The room listened, not just politely, but attentively, because Meera didn't speak like someone rehearsing triumph. She spoke like someone still walking the road, sharing the map as she went. After the applause faded, a young girl approached her backstage, tears in her eyes, saying, "You told my story out loud, except I haven't had a Sundar yet." Meera placed a hand gently on the girl's shoulder and said, "Then maybe I can be that for you, until you find your own." That single moment unraveled something deep in Meera. The fire that once burned only for her survival now spread outward, illuminating others. In the weeks that followed, she began mentoring more students, some in person, others through online sessions. She wrote short blog posts about navigating college as a working-class student, shared free study strategies, and helped coordinate book drives for young girls from underserved backgrounds. And slowly, without fanfare, she became what she had once searched for in others, a beacon. Of course, not all attention was pure. A few people online reduced her story to hashtags and catchphrases. Some skeptics accused her of exaggerating. Others speculated about Sundar's involvement with condescension, unable to accept that a CEO would help a maid without an ulterior motive. But Meera had grown immune to whispers. Her past had trained her to endure storms without drowning. One afternoon, as she walked across campus to her next class, she passed a new poster hanging on the student union wall. It featured her photo, mid-speech from the summit, with a caption, "Courage isn't loud, sometimes it whispers, try again tomorrow." She stopped and stared, not with pride, but with a kind of surreal disbelief. Not long ago, she would have hurried past such posters, too afraid to be seen. Now she stood before it, remembering every moment that led her there, every quiet choice, every insult endured, every late-night whisper to herself not to give up. That evening, when she returned to the Pichai household, she didn't go straight to the study. She found Sundar in the garden, tending to the herbs quietly, as he often did when the world felt too loud. She sat beside him, and for a while they said nothing. Then she smiled and said softly, "I think the world's listening now." Sundar didn't look up. Success, for all its glory and celebration, often carries within it a paradox. The more you rise, the more alone you may feel at the summit. For Meera, who had once studied beside plastic buckets in a dim pantry and now stood on stages surrounded by applause, the applause had begun to echo in a way that no longer felt as comforting. It was not that she wasn't grateful, she was. Every opportunity, every door, every chance to speak, to teach, to inspire. These were gifts she cherished with a reverence others often mistook for humility. But beneath that gratitude, quietly, pressing against the walls of her spirit, a new conflict had begun to form, a tension between the girl she once was and the woman the world now expected her to be. By the start of her second year at San Jose City College, Meera was no longer just a student. She was a symbol. Professors referred to her in lectures, first years quoted her talks, and her blog had amassed a modest but devoted following. Mentorship invitations poured in. She had even been nominated for a state-level scholarship reserved for first-generation college achievers. Her life, on paper, was everything the world loved to praise, the arc of triumph rising from ashes. But off paper, she had begun to feel split, one foot planted in the reality of lectures and research, and the other stuck in the memories of scrub brushes and unanswered dreams. What made it harder was the way people spoke to her now, so carefully, so reverently, as if she were no longer allowed to make mistakes. In group projects, her peers deferred to her instantly, afraid to challenge her ideas. In mentorship sessions, younger students treated her like a flawless oracle. No one asked her about her struggles anymore. They assumed she had conquered them, that she lived in a permanent state of wisdom. And when they said things like, "You're so lucky," or "You're the face of resilience," she didn't know how to say that luck was not how she remembered any of it. Luck didn't explain nights when her stomach ached from skipping dinner, so she could buy books. Luck didn't sit beside her while the world laughed behind her back, and resilience was not a title, it was a scar. One October evening, Meera sat at her desk in her small studio apartment, the one she had finally moved into with the help of a student housing program. The air was still, and the lamplight cast long shadows over the walls. Her phone blinked with new messages, requests to speak at 2 panels, an invitation to contribute to a tech magazine, and another congratulations from a fellow student who had just watched her podcast. Her scholarship interview was only a week away. She should have felt proud. Instead, she felt hollow. That night, she opened a blank document on her laptop, intending to draft her scholarship essay. The prompt was straightforward. Describe your proudest accomplishment and how it shaped your identity. But as she stared at the cursor blinking patiently, a wave of doubt broke over her. What was her identity now? Was she still the girl from the kitchen floors, or had she become something else? Did she belong in this world of tech jargon and fellowships, or was she simply borrowing time in a place that might one day close its doors? And more terrifying than anything, what if people only loved her story, but not her? What if she stopped being impressive and started being ordinary again? The questions festered in silence, so she closed the laptop and walked without thinking, barefoot, into the night air outside. She needed someone who understood the complexity of standing in 2 worlds. Sundar was in his home office, sorting through documents, but when he saw her at the doorway, he immediately set everything aside. He hadn't seen her in days. Both. Their lives had grown busier, but in her face he saw something deeper than exhaustion. He saw confusion, the kind that comes when the soul begins to outgrow its first armor. They sat in the dim library, the same space where her journey had begun, surrounded by old books, warm wood, and the quiet hum of distant memories. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Meera finally said, "I don't know who I'm becoming." Sundar didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for a book on the shelf and turned to a page he had once marked. "There's a concept in quantum physics," he said, "called superposition. It means a particle can exist in multiple states at once, until someone observes. Then it collapses into one state. Humans are not so different. You're still existing in multiple states: maid, student, speaker, mentor. And the world's attention is trying to collapse you into just one." Meera leaned back, absorbing the weight of his words. "But which one is the real me?" "They all are," he replied. The problem is, the world prefers stories with one version of truth, one identity, one ending. But your life is not a headline, it's a spectrum. She exhaled slowly. It's just, I used to know what I was fighting for. Now I feel like I'm becoming a symbol for people who don't even know me. Sundar nodded, then said something she never expected. When I became CEO, people stopped asking me what I feared. They assumed I had no doubts, no questions. But every day, I wonder if I'm enough for the position I hold. Not because I doubt my skills, but because leadership isn't a destination. It's a constant balancing act between legacy and humility. She looked at him, startled. You still feel that way? Especially now, he said with a quiet smile. That's how I know I haven't stopped growing. They sat in silence. Again, but this time it was peaceful. Eventually Meera reached into her bag and pulled out her scholarship prompt. I don't want to write about just accomplishments, she said. I want to write about everything. The mistakes, the confusion, the cost of becoming. Then write it, Sundar replied. Don't sell them the version they want. Show them the version that still bleeds. And so she did. That night, Meera poured her truth into the essay. She wrote about fear, not as weakness, but as a compass. She wrote about being underestimated, not just by others, but by herself. She described how even as she achieved more, she still wrestled with shame. Survivor's guilt, imposter syndrome, and the strange grief of outgrowing the people she once called home. She didn't glamorize resilience. She dissected it. And when she finished, she didn't care if the committee loved it. She cared that it was real. 2 weeks later, she received the result. She had won the scholarship. But by then, the news felt secondary. What mattered more was the quiet peace that had settled within her. For the first time in months, she wasn't performing her journey. She was owning it. In one of their later conversations, Sundar told her, there's a saying in Tamil, Thirai kadalo diyum, Thiraviam thedu. Even if the ocean stands in your way, go beyond it in search of knowledge. Meera looked at him, her eyes calm. The journey from invisibility to impact is never a straight line. It's not a staircase that leads from poverty to prestige without resistance. It's a winding, uneven path, full of forks that test the very soul of a person, who they are, what they value, and what they are willing to carry forward. And for Meera, the final leg of her journey wasn't marked by applause, scholarship checks, or media headlines. It was marked by a choice so personal, so quietly seismic, that no audience would ever fully understand its weight. It came in the form of an email. A formal, neatly worded invitation from a prestigious global tech institute in Switzerland, offering her a full academic fellowship for a specialized AI research program. The kind of opportunity that could redefine her career, grant her access to cutting-edge labs, global networks, and a fast track to working with some of the most influential minds in technology. It was the kind of offer that most students would accept in less than a heartbeat. And for a moment, Meera did feel the rush of validation, the thrill of knowing that her long nights and buried self-doubt had led to this door, wide open, just for her. But then, as she sat with the letter on her screen and 1,000 dreams flooding her vision, her phone buzzed. It was her younger brother, Arav. The video call connected slowly. His small, thin face appeared with a familiar grin. Still missing one front tooth, his eyes lit with joy at seeing her. He was sitting on the bed in their modest shared apartment in East San Jose, surrounded by the stacks of notebooks and donated storybooks she'd been sending him over the past year. He held one up proudly. Akka, I finished all the chapters, even the hard ones. You said if I passed the next test, you'd visit again. Will you come? Her throat tightened. She hadn't seen him in weeks. The demands of college, public speaking, part-time research work, and community mentorship had pulled her in too many directions. But now, his voice, pure, hopeful, grounding, tore through all the layers of ambition she'd been wrapped in. He wasn't a distraction. He was the reason for all of it. After ending the call, Meera didn't respond to the Swiss Institute right away. She walked for hours that night, through dim city streets and moonlit trails, trying to make sense of the impossible tension in her heart. On one hand, there was the world calling her upward, a place of labs, fellowships, and innovation. On the other, there was the world that had raised her, a world still in need of her, still hurting, still hungry for hope. She remembered a conversation with Sundar months earlier during one of their walks when she had asked him if he ever felt torn between his origins and his position at the top. He had answered her carefully. Sometimes our greatest challenge is not choosing between wrong and right, but between good and good. Now that truth pressed against her ribcage like a stone. The Swiss fellowship was good, helping Arav finish school, continuing her mentorship program, and launching the community education initiative she'd been quietly planning. That was good too. At the next study session with Sundar, she brought the offer letter. She laid it on the table in front of him like a confession. They want me to start in January. I'd be gone for 2 years. He read it carefully. When he looked up, his expression held no surprise, only stillness. "And how do you feel?" he asked. "I feel split," she said honestly. "This is the future I dreamed of. But I keep thinking, what happens to my brother if I leave? What happens to the younger girls I'm helping now? I finally found a way to give back. If I go now, I'll feel like I'm abandoning the thing I started." He leaned back, folding his hands in thought. "Everyone talks about changing the world," he said, "but the world isn't some distant planet. It's right here, your block, your family, your classroom. You don't need to choose between greatness and service. You just need to define greatness for yourself." Her eyes burned, but she held them open. "So you're saying I shouldn't go?" He smiled gently. "I'm not saying anything. I've never given you orders, only mirrors. What you choose now is about who you want to be, not who others want you to become." That night, Meera wrote 2 letters. One was a thank you and a graceful declination to the Swiss Institute, expressing her hope to revisit the opportunity in the future. The second was a grant proposal she'd been quietly drafting for weeks. An ambitious plan to create a local tech and literacy hub for underserved students in San Jose. A space with donated laptops, rotating mentors, academic workshops, and emotional support programs for students like she once was, bright, invisible, and forgotten. She submitted the proposal to a regional non-profit the following day. In the weeks that followed, as others in her circle celebrated internship placements and graduate program offers, Meera began laying bricks for something deeper, something slower and harder, but far more enduring. Her initiative, named The Quiet Uprising, launched 3 months later in a repurposed library annex near her old neighborhood. The space was small but alive, with chalkboards, beanbags, worn computers, and an army of volunteers who believed in what she believed, that no one should have to earn the right to be seen. Arav became the first junior mentor, proudly, tutoring even younger children who had never seen anyone from their street do anything like this before. And Meera? She didn't wear titles, she didn't need them, she wore her purpose like armor. Sundar came to the center on the day of its opening. He didn't speak publicly or pose for photos. He simply walked through the halls, watched the students, and met the volunteers. Then, as he stood beside Meera near the front door, he whispered, "You didn't go to Switzerland, but you've created something here that they'll study for years." She looked at him, not with admiration but with kinship. "I didn't go far," she said, "but I finally arrived." Years later, long after the center had expanded to multiple cities, after Meera had been honored at global stages and invited back to the institute she once declined, after her blog turned into a published memoir, translated into 11 languages. Someone asked her at a press event, "When did you know you had succeeded?" She paused, her eyes flicking to a framed photo of Arav, now in medical school, and then to a picture of the first cohort of girls she had mentored. Smiling, fearless, unstoppable,